This week, we are going to dive into one of our favorite episodes, episode number 113, all about the power of movement. Now, this episode was originally recorded in a little segment, little kind of unit on early childhood, but I think the reality is that movement is just important regardless. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump back in time to past Bryson.
You're listening to That Music Podcast with Bryson Tarbett, the curriculum designer and educational consultant behind That Music Teacher and the Elementary Music Summit. Each week, Bryson and his guests will dive into the reality of being an elementary music teacher and how music can truly be transformative in the lives of the students you serve. Show notes and resources mentioned in this episode can be found at thatmusicteacher.com.
Hello and welcome back to this episode of That Music Podcast. I am super excited to talk today about the power of movement. More specifically, the power of movement in a preschool or kindergarten or some sort of early childhood setting. I think it's so important in general, but especially as elementary music teachers, for us to make sure that we are including movement into our lessons. And it's more than just the power of movement and how it can show musical concepts, but also how we can make sure we're setting our students up for success. So we're really going to be talking about the significance in movement, especially in, like I said, that preschool and that kindergarten music education setting. We're going to be talking about how music can enhance the learning and the engagement for young children. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So let's talk about our first little area, our first kind of little tidbit, which is the role of movement in early childhood development. The real thing that comes down here is there is so much that goes into early childhood education, but it's really interesting to see how much of that kind of goes in with the gross motor and the fine motor skills. So obviously when I say gross motor and fine motor, I mean gross motor, things like maybe things that you might do in gym, running, throwing a ball, jumping, skipping. Fine motor being more of those things like holding a pencil, tying a shoe, things like that. They're a little smaller. Those are both really important, and we need to do more focus in the elementary setting. We tend to focus a little bit more on the gross motor things in a music setting. Obviously, there are definitely fine motor things that we do, but a lot of what we do, a lot of what I do in my classroom is that gross motor. Not only getting those kids to practice those gross motor skills, but also allowing them the opportunity to move and explore through movement. I've really noticed that whenever I include more movement in my lessons, my students tend to be more successful. And that can really be a couple different things. One, they're able to regulate their sensory needs a little bit better because we're making sure we're being developmentally appropriate, right? Think about kindergarten or preschool music. If we wanted them to sit crisscross applesauce for 40 minutes, they're probably not going to be successful at that. Now, yes, we can have them sit crisscross and have them, sitting down during the lesson. But if we're wanting that to happen the entire lesson, our expectations are not matching the reality and the developmental appropriateness of that student. So movement can just have this huge opportunity for us to kind of piggyback on the learning that's happening in their classroom gross motor wise, but also allow us to unlock so much musicality through that movement. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about how we can use creative movement for musical learning. Obviously, there are definitely things that happen, when you're doing more gross motor that are just like great for childhood development, but let's focus a little bit more on the musical things. When we're talking about creative movement, it can look a lot of different ways. For me, I tend to just get my students up and moving and responding to that music. So I might play music or, do something that they're able to listen and then respond to that through some sort of movement. And you're going to run into two different types of students. You're going to run into students that are really gung-ho about getting ready and doing the movement and just like diving right in. And then you're going to see some students that are really reserved because this is not maybe they're a little bit more, black and white, and they kind of see that, it's either this or this, and there's not really in between. So we need to give them options. And it's kind of like giving them a vocabulary of movements giving them away, I always start with locomotor movements versus non-locomotor movements. And if you're not familiar with that, locomotor is when movements travel through space, and non-locomotor is when they are staying in one place. My students really, they like to generalize that as standing still and moving, but the reality is you can move while being non-locomotor. So I always start with that, giving them the option, because that alone, that is a big terminology, a big, piece of vocabulary that they're going to be able to use to create different movements. Some of them might be move me. Some of them might, okay, Kat, we can't do this. That alone is really going to give them the vocabulary to start building on their musical kind of understanding and their movement understanding, because it's going to give them some different choices right off the bat. And another way you can do that is give them examples. And when you see a student that's doing something that you think is like, oh, that's a great idea, that is when you're like, oh, Johnny, I love how Johnny is moving in a very creative way, and just showing that there are more options. And the best way that I think you can do this, especially for those students that are a little apprehensive and they're like, I'm not really so sure about this thing, do it yourself. You be the silly one, because then they don't have to worry about being the silly one, because, well, Mr. Tarbit's already being silly. I guess I can let my guard down and realize that there really aren't any wrong answers as long as I'm following the guidelines that we've been given. One of my favorite activities to do with kindergarten, I use this in kindergarten, not necessarily at preschool, but I definitely, you can adapt it for that younger age, just putting hula hoops around the room and then having students, when the music stops, find a hula hoop, and they stand in the hula hoop. The hula hoops are always staying on the ground. I always have to give that clarification. But it allows them the opportunity to experience the music. And what I like to have them do is move to the music. So maybe it's walking to the beat, or, moving their arms, or showing the highs, the lows, in between, make their body big, make their body small, and see what they can come up with, because a lot of times the kids can really get into that. And when the music stops, they find a hula hoop and they stay there. Sometimes you can make it, all right, find a hula hoop and make a pose, but it doesn't need to be that complicated. Movement is a really good way to work with different concepts such as dynamics, tempo. It's so much easier, especially for a lot of these things where it's like changing the way that the music is interpreted. It's a really good way for us to allow the students to experience it, rather than telling, all right, forte is loud and piano is quiet. We can actually have them show with their body what it feels like, and they're able to do it. And because we're working with multiple modalities, we're not just saying, all right, this is forte, it's loud. They're able to bring it into their body and actually show a kinesthetic connection to it. It's going to link into their long-term memory a lot easier. And that's kind of like the whole point, right? We really want them to stick around, or, kind of stick with the information that we have, rather than taking it in one year, maybe getting it for that class, but then having it completely disappear the next. So how can we make movement even more fun, especially kind of taking it into that preschool level? Is instruments. Who doesn't love instruments? And I know some of you are probably sitting there going, Bryson, I don't want my preschoolers to have instruments. Like, that's just chaotic. And the reality is, yes, it's going to be chaotic. It's going to be a little interesting. It's going to be probably loud. So what can we do to set this up for success, and also set those expectations that, okay, I know this part's going to be loud, so I'm going to make sure on other ends of this activity, we have things that aren't necessarily as sensory intense. One of my favorite instruments for preschool are those egg shakers. They're cheap. They make a wonderful sound. They could even be made by the students if they wanted to. And the students love them. They love using the egg shakers, and it is an absolute blast. So those are great because it's very obvious when there's a sound going and where there's a sound not. And it's also very hard to keep your eggs not making any sound if you yourself are moving. So a great way to do this, the same activity I talked about earlier with the preschool or the kindergartners and the hula hoops, is giving your students, maybe they're preschoolers, maybe they're kindergartners, whatever, giving them an egg shaker and having them move. And when the music stops, or when you stop playing the drum, or when you play a triangle, or whatever kind of your cue is, they have to freeze and make a pose. And they have to freeze in a way that their egg shaker is not making any sound. Another way you can do this is having a drum, even if it's just you as a teacher, keeping the beat on the drum as you're moving along. And maybe as you go through, having a student, play the drum as you pass them, or whatever. When you're able to incorporate instruments into the movement, it can be really, really helpful. Rhythm sticks are another great way. Having them click the beat as they're walking the beat is another great connection. You could also just, sometimes they get really creative with the ways they can use the instruments to help make movements. For instance, if you give a kid 2 rhythm sticks, there's a very good chance you're probably going to have some kids that are instantly are like lightsabers and go zooming around. Now, how can we reframe that in a way that's not probably going to hurt somebody, but also a little bit more appropriate to the music? That's where we can be like, hey, what if we did that in slow motion? And then we have students that are moving around that, yes, it's just Jedi lightsabers, but super slow motion, but it's more appropriate for the music. It's more appropriate for the classroom setting. And they still get to be a Jedi, because let's be honest, sometimes our kids just want to swing around with some lightsabers, right? And it's another way that we can use an instrument, not necessarily as a sound maker, but as another way to respond to the music. This next part is for our Dalcrozian friends out there. I'll be honest, I don't have much experience using any sort of Dalcroze inspired teaching, but like formally, any trainings in that, but I've loved what I've been able to gather from workshops and online and things like that, and use the power of storytelling in movement. One of my favorite things that my kids do that my kids ask for is basically, we call them piano stories. So essentially, these kind of started with my kindergartners, like, oh, we have 5 minutes and these kindergartners need to move. Basically, we have them make a story. So usually I have them starting and ending sleeping so that they're kind of more contained. So they're laying on the floor and they're sleeping. And then I play something on the piano that's kind of sounds like morning. And then they wake up and, oh, they might have a loud sound and they have to show me how they would react to that sound. All right. And then, I might say, all right, well, we have all of our bunnies, and our bunnies decided that they wanted to find some carrots. So they went hopping through the forest. Dun, 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 and they're hopping around the room. They're showing that movement. And then, oh no, dum, 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 dum. And then basically just another way of showing the movement. So basically they have to respond to the music that I'm playing through their movement. Sometimes I'm telling a story specifically. Sometimes I say, oh, they opened the door and what did they find, Johnny? And Johnny might say, a zebra, or Johnny might say, a piece of bubble gum, and whatever. We just kind of go with it, right? We kind of take that through, and it becomes this really cool community event and community like music making and movement experience that just is so much more than just singing and dancing. I would be absolutely remiss if we talked about movement, but we didn't touch on making sure that movement is inclusive. So whenever you're designing lessons that have movement, make sure that you are fully understanding the students that you have. For instance, if you have students with limited mobility, or students that are in a wheelchair, or students that might have a low task stamina, how can we get them to make sure that they are still included, that they can still do all the activities? How can we modify the curriculum? How can we modify those movements? How can we give them other options? How can we give them choices, so that they're, if they're one that's really hard at making decisions, or maybe those decisions can cause undue anxiety, they're able to, all right, instead of having to think of all the different things, I have to pick one of these two. Those can be really ways to make it more accessible, and really understanding that when you have these inclusive practices in place, your classroom dynamics and the self-esteem of your students, for all of your students, is greatly increased. So don't forget about that in movement. There's nothing worse than creating a movement activity or coming up with something that you're like, wow, my kids are going to love this, and then realizing that it's really setting up one or two of your students up, they're setting them up for failure and not really thinking that ahead. So make sure whenever you're doing any movement activities, you're always thinking ahead, so that you make sure that everyone can be a part of the music making or the movement, or whatever you're doing in your classroom. I hope you enjoyed that episode from The Vault. As always, if you haven't left us a review on iTunes or YouTube, wherever you're listening or watching, it would mean the world to us if you were to do so. It helps us get in front of new music educators just like you, but also helps us understand what types of conversations we want to have some more of. With that being said, thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a wonderful week. And in case no one has told you lately, thank you so much for making a difference in the lives of the students that you teach.